All right, so get ready because today we are diving into some serious history. Boudicca's revolt against the Romans in 61 AD. We've got all our research, and trust me, this isn't just going to be boring dates and battles. This is about understanding why this warrior queen was such a huge threat and how her actions affected Colchester specifically, and why her story is still so powerful all these centuries later.
You know, what's so interesting about this period is that Roman Britain was still pretty new. So you've got this clash of cultures going on and ambitions and struggles for power, and Colchester, as the very first Roman capital of Britain, was right in the middle of it all.
Okay, I'm hooked already. So
Yeah.
Colchester's like the ultimate prize, which obviously makes it a target. But who is Boudica and what made her decide to take on Rome?
Well, Boudica was the queen of the Iceni tribe, which was located in what's now Norfolk. She was famous for her fierceness and her strategic thinking, but her revolt wasn't just about grabbing power, it was personal.
Okay, so let's get into that. I've always been fascinated by how personal stories can drive these major historical events.
Well, her husband, Prestatagus, actually tried to work with the Romans. He left his kingdom jointly to his daughters and to Emperor Nero in his will. He was hoping to make sure they'd be protected. But the Romans, well, let's just say they didn't really stick to that agreement.
Oh, that sounds like a recipe for disaster. So what happened?
The Roman governor at the time saw this as a chance to take advantage of the situation. He seized the Iceni lands and to really rub salt into the wound. Boudica and her daughters were publicly flogged and humiliated. This personal tragedy sparked a huge wave of resentment that went way beyond just the Iceni tribe.
Wow, that's intense. So this wasn't just about land, it was about dignity and respect and standing up to what a lot of people saw as Roman tyranny.
Exactly, and that's what made Boudica such a strong leader. She tapped into this anger against Roman oppression that had been building up for years, and Colchester, as a colonia, a settlement for retired Roman soldiers, was really vulnerable to this type of uprising.
Why Colchester specifically? What made it different from other Roman settlements?
Well, as a colonia, Colchester had a big population of these retired soldiers who'd been given land, and that land had often been taken by force from local British tribes. This caused a lot of tension and resentment. It's important to remember that this wasn't just some abstract political thing. Real people were being kicked off their land, their way of life destroyed, and their culture suppressed.
Yeah, you can practically feel the anger and frustration simmering, just waiting to explode, and then Boudica comes along.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Boudica gave these incredibly inspiring speeches, uniting not just the Iceni but also the neighboring Trinovantes tribe, who had their own issues with the Romans, and then she led this massive combined force to attack Colchester, the symbol of Roman power in Britain. The historical accounts describe the city burning, and that's not just a dramatic story, it's backed up by archaeology.
Wait, you're telling me they found actual evidence of this attack?
Oh, absolutely. Underneath modern-day Colchester, there's a layer of ash and debris. It's known as Boudica's layer. Imagine that you could be walking around Colchester today and have no idea that right under your feet are the remains of this epic battle.
That's incredible. It really brings history to life in a way that textbooks just can't. And the destruction wasn't random, right? They targeted symbols of Roman power.
Exactly. They went after things that represented Roman authority, like the Temple of Claudius. This huge monument to Roman rule, it was completely destroyed.
Wow, a direct attack on Roman power. That's a powerful statement. I'm guessing this wasn't just a small setback for the Romans either.
You're right, it was a major blow to their control. And remember, Boudica's forces didn't just stop at Colchester. They went on to attack Londinium and Verulamium, modern-day London and St. Albans.
So this was a full-blown coordinated revolt, not just a local uprising. This is big.
Yes, and what's really amazing is that the revolt was so successful at the beginning that it almost caused the Romans to pull out of Britain completely.
Hold on, are you serious? The Romans almost left Britain for good. That would have totally changed everything. What stopped them?
Well, the historical records seem to say that Emperor Nero was really close to ordering a withdrawal.
Yeah.
Just imagine Roman Britain, only a few decades after they conquered it, could have just disappeared. But his advisors convinced him to stay and crush the rebellion.
I guess that shows you just how seriously they took this threat, but how did they get back in control? Boudica had united multiple tribes and caused some serious damage. It's not like the Romans could just stroll back in and everyone would just go back to listening to them.
Oh no, it definitely wasn't easy. A lot of different things were going on. For one thing, the Romans were, a very organized and experienced military force. They were able to pull themselves together, get some backup, and come up with a plan to counter Boudica's tactics.
Okay, so their military power had something to do with it, but was that really enough to completely stop such a widespread revolt?
No, you're right. Military strength was only one part of the story. The Romans also knew that they needed to fix the underlying problems that had caused the rebellion in the first place.
That's interesting. So they realized that just using force wouldn't be enough to keep things under control. What did they do differently?
They started being more willing to compromise when it came to governing Britain, at least for a while. They put in place policies that were aimed at reducing the resentment among the native people. They eased up on some of the more oppressive economic policies, and they made an effort to show respect for the local customs and traditions.
So it was like a carrot and stick approach, crush the rebellion with military force, and then try to win people over with nicer policies. Was this a genuine change of heart or just a way to prevent future uprisings?
That's a really good question, and it's something that historians still debate about today. Was it real, or was it just a strategy to stay in power? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. It was likely a mix of practicality and recognizing that their heavy-handed approach had really backfired.
Okay, so the Romans get back in control, but what about Boudica? What happened to her after those first victories?
Well, unfortunately, her story doesn't have a happy ending, even though she had early successes. Boudica's forces were eventually defeated in a big battle. The exact details are still being argued about by historians, but the Roman accounts suggest that they were simply outnumbered and outmaneuvered.
I can only imagine how awful that must have been for her and all of her followers to come so close to winning only to be defeated by the Roman army. What happened to Boudica after they lost?
The most common story is that she poisoned herself. Rather than be captured and humiliated by the Romans, it shows her incredible spirit and her dedication to freedom, even in defeat. She refused to become a Roman prisoner.
Wow, that's a powerful end to a truly amazing life. It's easy to see why her story is still so inspiring today. Centuries later, she stood up to an empire, fought for her people's freedom, and in the end became a symbol of her cause.
That's it exactly, and that's why Boudica's story is more than just historical facts and figures. It's about courage and resilience and fighting against oppression. It's a story that speaks to anyone who has ever felt powerless or pushed aside.
But even though she lost, did Boudica's rebellion have a lasting impact on Roman Britain? I mean, besides the obvious destruction and loss of life?
Absolutely. Boudica's revolt was a wake-up call for the Romans. It forced them to really think about how they were running Britain. Remember that change toward more compromising policies we talked about earlier? That wasn't just a temporary thing. It actually changed how the Romans ruled Britain for good.
Interesting. So, in a way, Boudica's rebellion made the Romans become better rulers, less oppressive, more willing to compromise.
You could say that it showed them that force alone wasn't enough to keep things stable. They needed to find ways to keep the locals happy. And included in the Roman system, at least to some degree, this led to a pretty peaceful and prosperous period in Roman Britain. But that doesn't mean everyone just forgot what happened.
What do you mean?
Well, the memory of Boudica's revolt stayed alive. She became this strong symbol of resistance against the Romans, a true representation of British defiance, even centuries later, long after the Romans had left Britain. Her story was still being told.
So it's more than just a historical footnote. It's a story that has lasted through time, inspiring generations with its message of bravery and standing up for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you.
Exactly, and that leads us to another really fascinating part of Boudica's legacy, how her story has been interpreted and reinterpreted throughout history. It reminds us that history isn't fixed. It's always being shaped and reshaped by the people who are telling it.
It's amazing how someone from so long ago can still be so important. So we've got Roman oppression, a warrior queen, a city on fire. What's the big takeaway for someone who's just learning about this?
I think Boudica's story is a reminder that history isn't just dates and names. It's about people, their reasons for doing things, and the decisions they made. Boudica's choice to fight back, even though she knew it was dangerous, changed Roman Britain forever.
It really makes you wonder what would happen if things had gone differently. Like if Nero had actually taken the Romans out of Britain, how would that have changed the world we live in today?
It's a really interesting question, right? Would Britain have developed a totally different culture and language? Would the Roman Empire have fallen apart sooner? It's impossible to say for sure, but it's something to think about.
Okay, so besides the big picture stuff, let's go back to Colchester. We've talked about the attack and the fire, but how did the city recover after something so devastating?
Well, the Romans, being the practical people, rebuilt Colchester. They knew it was a strategically important place and a symbol of their power. But like we said before, the revolt made them rethink how they did things. They couldn't just rebuild the buildings. They needed to rebuild trust, or at least try to.
So how did they do that when they were rebuilding Colchester? Were there any signs of this new, more compromising approach?
Oh, absolutely. For example, they rebuilt the Temple of Claudius, that symbol of Roman power. But they also allowed some local religious practices to continue. They put money into infrastructure like roads and public baths that benefited both the Romans and the native people. They even let some Britons become Roman citizens, which gave them certain rights.
It sounds like they were trying to create a more integrated society instead of just forcing Roman culture on everyone. Was that a real effort or just another way to stay in control?
That's the big question, isn't it? And there's no easy answer. It was probably a mix of being practical and honestly wanting to create a more stable and successful province. But the fact is that Boudica's revolt forced them to change. They realized that being totally oppressive just wasn't going to work in the long run.
It's a really cool example of how even a rebellion that fails can still make a difference and change how a whole society is governed.
Exactly, and that's what makes studying history so interesting. It's not just about memorizing facts, it's about understanding how things are connected, the unexpected things that happen, and the lasting effects that shape our world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Boudica's revolt, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this?
I think it's important to remember that anyone can make a difference, even when it seems like you're fighting an impossible battle. Boudica's story shows us the power of courage, the desire for freedom, and how even a rebellion that doesn't succeed can have a huge impact.
Well said. And for our listener, if you ever find yourself in Colchester, take a moment to think about that layer of ash right beneath your feet. It's a real reminder of the events we've been talking about and the powerful legacy of Boudica, the warrior queen who dared to challenge an empire. Thanks for listening, everyone.